Good evening, folks. It's about 8:20, and I'd like to apologize if you were tuning in earlier to my Exodus lesson. You saw me up front and waving my arms around, but you did not hear anything, and we are not sure why that happened again. We thought we did everything right. It's all over my head in terms of the technology, but people smarter than me are going to try to figure out why it's done that now a couple of times, once on a Sunday and once before on this lesson. But we apologize, and so I thought in the past we've even recorded it so we could re-put it up there later. Apparently that didn't happen tonight either. So I'm here at the church up in one of the Sunday school rooms. I thought it's all fresh on my mind, so let me, if you were looking forward to hearing the last lesson on Exodus, I'll just do it again. It might be a little shorter than the one in front of the folks in the sanctuary, but I'll try to make sure I cover the same ground for you folks who've been waiting to hear it. So let me start with a word of prayer. Lord, thanks for the miracle of technology when it works, when it doesn't. I'm thankful now that I could connect with folks who are interested in this great story of your deliverance of your people out of bondage and into the promised land, and ask that you'd be with us this night and guide us with your spirit. We pray in your name. Amen. One of the things that when I was a third grader, I got my third grade Bible at First Methodist Church in Bartlesville. And I hope the other kids read their Bibles, and I hope our third graders read their Bibles. But I was pretty serious about it, and so I was reading it every night. And you get through Genesis, and there's lots of great stories: the garden, Noah's Ark, the Tower of Babel, then Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and the 12 sons and Joseph and his amazing colored coat and all that. And you're just reading it all. It's great. Get to Exodus, again, exciting. Slavery, bondage, the people getting released through the power of God, the burning bush, the plagues. And you're working your way through the Exodus, and then you run into some of the things we talked about last week, which is smack dab in the middle of it, page after page and chapter after chapter of legal codes, not just the Ten Commandments, but these civic codes and ceremonial laws. What happens if my ox gores your ox? How much do I have to pay you? How much if I accidentally knock a tooth out? You're allowed to knock one of my teeth out, but not two teeth, and all these things that are kind of part of the laws that I believe, and most scholars believe, were not part of Mount Sinai, that these were case law, that as the book of Exodus got orally told over and over and over again, passed down from father to son and daughter and around the campfire and around the family dinner table, that as they were putting it together from the oral tradition down into a written document, that by the time they did that, they'd added a lot of laws taken from the Ten Commandments, just like we take our laws from the Constitution. But a lot of this case law had come into effect in the people of Israel. And so it gets put together with the Word of God, the Ten Commandments. As I've said before, the Scriptures, I believe, are completely inspired by God, but also completely human. Just like Jesus was 100% God, 100% divine, the incarnation of the eternal Son of God, and also completely human. He sweated, he bled, he got hungry, he got thirsty, he stubbed his toe, he had acne as a teenager. Fully human and fully divine. I believe the Scripture is indeed inspired by God, but at the same time, God used human authors to record the stories, to tell the stories, to put it all in its final form. And so they're writing from a perspective of their culture, their language, their time. And so sometimes it doesn't resonate with us. It doesn't sound like what we would say. Sometimes there's some repetition. Sometimes there's some things that seem out of order. And that's because God used human authors to put it all together. If you read the book of Exodus, like I did when I was a third grader, you're reading along a story of history of a man named Moses and his encounters with God. And then you get all these legal things, chapter after chapter of legal codes. And then you get architectural plans for how to build the tabernacle. And then you get the description of how to sew an outfit for the high priest. And you get all this stuff kind of mixed in there. I said tonight to the folks in the sanctuary, it'd be like if you were reading a book about Thomas Jefferson. It talks about his contribution to the Declaration of Independence, and then there's a lot suddenly about America's legal system, and then suddenly there's the architectural plans for Jefferson home, his home in Monticello, and then suddenly there's a description of his clothing, and then recipes for his favorite food, and it's all in the same book, and you would go, this is a hodgepodge of stuff. Well, that's kind of the way Exodus is. It's a lot of stuff. You'll be reading along a narrative of the history, and then here's several chapters of legal codes or plans on how to build the tabernacle. So let's pick up. Last time we were in chapters 21, 22, where we read about personal injury laws, about what to do with servants or slaves. What happens if two men are fighting and one gets a tooth knocked out? You're allowed to knock out another tooth, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. But no more than that. It's to keep escalation down so that people won't, you knock my tooth out, well, I'm going to knock your whole mouth out. And then I'm going to go after your son too. And then you're going to come after my whole village. And escalation. And that eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth was a law to keep things from being escalated and getting out of hand. Then Jesus comes around in the first century and says, you've heard it said, eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say, turn the other cheek, go the extra mile, pray for those who persecute you, love your enemies. Jesus takes a whole different tack. So we had those laws last time in chapters 21 and 22 about property laws. There's laws in chapter 22 about not mistreating an alien. Because it says you were aliens in Egypt, so don't mistreat the foreigners in your midst. And again, that's probably more not about the time in the desert as much as it is once they settled into the land of Canaan. There's an interesting verse there in chapter 22 of Exodus. It says 22:25, if you lend money to one of my people among you who's needy, do not be like the moneylender, charge him no interest. That's just kind of stuck in there in the middle of chapter 22 of Exodus, but it has far-reaching implications. By the time Christianity became the dominant religion in Europe, and the leaders of Christianity in the Middle Ages began to take seriously some of these Old Testament laws and decided, is this a moral law, or is this a ceremonial law, or is this a civic law? They saw this one about interest as a moral imperative not to charge interest. So they forbade Christians from charging interest. Well, by that time, the Jewish people had read it as saying, don't charge a fellow Jew interest, but it's okay to charge other people interest. The upshot of that was, by the time of the Middle Ages, many people in the Jewish community had gone into the banking business. And by the end of the Middle Ages, many of the banks of Europe were owned and run by people who were Jewish, because the Christians had been forbidden from charging interest, which is kind of the heart of the banking business. Well, why is that important? Well, in the 20th century, after World War I, Germany was under huge financial debt and problems. The economy of Germany collapsed. Hitler was looking for a scapegoat. So who did he blame? He blamed the Jewish people who were involved in the banking industry. He blamed the Jewish people because they were the primary people who were the bankers in Europe. That was one of the excuses that Hitler used for exterminating the Jewish people. I had the opportunity when we were in Poland a few years ago to go to Auschwitz, where that final solution of Hitler was carried out. And we know 6 million Jews were exterminated by the Nazis. But one of the excuses that they used was blaming the Jewish people for the collapse of the economy, because of the Christians being barred from being in that industry, so many Jewish people were in the banking industry. So you see how one little verse in the Bible can have impact way beyond maybe what was ever thought that it could impact. So that's in chapter 22. Chapter 23 reiterates an interesting verse about, it says 23:4. If you come across your enemy's ox or donkey wandering off, be sure to take it back to him. So even if it's your enemy's donkey who's wandered off, you are under the obligation to say, hey, here's your donkey. I saw it wandering down the road. I guess the modern application of that, if you see a thief breaking into your neighbor's house, even if you can't stand your neighbor, even if he parks in your driveway and doesn't mow his lawn and plays his music too loud and is rude to your kids. Even so, if you see somebody breaking into his house, you need to call the police. You need to take care even of the people that are not your friends in that situation. There are laws there in chapter 23 about keeping the Sabbath. There's a reiteration of the Jewish festivals. There's even God saying, here's the borders. When you go into Palestine, when you go into Canaan, here's the borders of your nation. It's in 23:31. I'll establish your borders from the Red Sea to the Sea of the Philistines, which is usually the Mediterranean, and from the desert to the river, which is the Euphrates. And so God is even telling his people out there, when you get into Canaan, here's the boundary lines that you are to take this land from the Canaanites. And he, of course, lists, the Hivites and the Jebusites and all the other ites who lived in Canaan. Now we get to chapter 24, and the people say, we will obey you, Lord. We accept this covenant. And this covenant is affirmed multiple times. You get to chapter 25, however, and you really get to chapter 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31. All those are details about how to build the tabernacle, what the furniture is supposed to look like in the tabernacle, how to make the Ark of the Covenant, which, remember, if you've ever seen the Indiana Jones movie, Raiders of the Lost Ark, you've seen their representation of the Ark of the Covenant, which is pretty accurate. The Ark of the Covenant was a big box about the size of a coffin, covered in gold. The lid, also gold, had two angels on the lid with their wings spread, sort of looking at each other. And inside of that box, of that coffin-sized box, were the relics of God's power, a jar of the manna, the rod that was used in Pharaoh to show the miracles. Things like that were placed inside the ark. And eventually that ark is placed in the very center of the tabernacle, and then eventually in the center of the temple. Now those two terms, we got to make sure we know which one's which. The tabernacle is the traveling, portable worship area that the people of Israel used in the desert and used all the way until Solomon built the temple, which is hundreds of years later. The tabernacle is a portable sanctuary that the people of Israel used as their worship space until the time of Solomon, son of David, when Solomon built the magnificent temple there in Jerusalem. So the tabernacle was an outdoor worship space. When we've gone to Camp Egan for many camps and retreats, they have an outdoor worship space that they call the tabernacle. A tabernacle is usually an outdoor worship space. Earlier today on Facebook, we posted 3 handouts, and one of them is a drawing of the tabernacle. And I've realized that when I do this on my phone, things can look backwards. So go to Facebook and it'll be forwards, but there's this handout, and you can see what it is. And again, just to hold it up, even if the letters are backwards, if you hold it up, you see that it is a series of tents forming a big rectangle. And in the center of that is all kinds of interesting things. If you want to go to that Facebook post with this handout. Inside that big rectangle is a place where offerings can be burned. There's a place to wash the priest's hands. There's an inside part called the holy place. And inside that is the Holy of Holies. And this is something that is then replicated later on when they build the permanent temple. The holy place, only the priest could go in there. And the Holy of Holies, only the high priest could go in there once a year on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, which is really, I believe this week is when Yom Kippur is on the Jewish calendar, the Day of Atonement. Now the holy place, the word in Latin for holy is sanctus. Sanctus is the Latin word for holy. If you've ever been a choir and sung one of the great Latin masses, sanctus, sanctus, sanctus. Well, where did we get our word sanctuary? Well, from that Latin word sanctus. So the sanctuary is literally the holy place. When we gather in the sanctuary, we're gathering in the holy place. Well, the holy place in the tabernacle is where the priests would go to offer the sacrifices to God. And the Holy of Holies was where they kept the Ark of the Covenant. And it was there on the Day of Atonement that the high priest would go in and he would offer the sacrifice for the whole nation there in the Holy of Holies. One of the other handouts we handed out, and again, it's on Facebook, is this one, which is the garment of the high priest. And again, you can pull that off of Facebook. But it's a handout that shows that the high priest had a turban. He had a breastplate that had 12 stones in it representing the 12 tribes of Israel. He had a sash across his waist. At the bottom of the robe, there was decoration of pomegranates, which is one of the symbols of Israel, the pomegranate. We had, some of us from our church had the opportunity in 2019 to go to Israel. Wonderful trip. It's a wonderful place. I said when we got back, I hope to do that again in 3 or 4 years. Well, then COVID happened, and then this one I thought maybe it's time to try to plan another trip. All the unrest in the Middle East arose, and right now there's no groups going to Israel. There's no tourists in Israel now. And I'm not sure when that will be a possibility again. I hope it will be. I hope there is eventually peace, a settlement, a ceasefire, some sort of lasting peace between Israel and her neighbors. Hopefully the terrorist groups like Hamas and Hezbollah will be silenced, rooted out, and Iran will stop meddling, and all those things we could hope for. It's a big hope and a big wish and a big prayer. That part of the world has not seen a lot of peace for thousands of years. But when we went about 5 years ago, it was a time of relative peace, and we felt perfectly safe, and we got to explore Israel. And all that to say, the pomegranate was everywhere. As a decoration on the street, there were fresh pomegranate juice stands, and several folks in our group got addicted, well, maybe not addicted, but got to be loving the pomegranate juice. And that's something that's a symbol of Israel, and it's part of that high priest's outfit. So you see in those chapters, chapter 25 and 26, we have the Ark of the Covenant and the description of how to build the tabernacle, and the garments of the priest in chapter 28, all details about all that. And the consecration of the priests, and the incense, and the oil, and the on and on and on. I didn't go into any of that tonight with the group in the sanctuary, because frankly, it's so much easier to look at a picture. To look at a picture of the tabernacle and go, okay, that's what it looked like. Or to look at a picture of the high priest's outfit and get a sense of, okay, that's what it looked like. That's what those chapters go into. You're free, of course, to go read those, but they are very detailed about this is how many cubits long each piece of cloth should be, and this is how much you make the poles that hold up the tent with, and on and on and on, and how you make the wash basin. And it's a very detailed description. It's not particularly fascinating. When I was a third grader and I was reading through my brand new Bible and I got to all this stuff, that slowed me down, because I went from exciting stories to descriptions of how to build a portable sanctuary with tents and tent poles. And it kind of slowed you down. So feel free to read all that, but I'm not going to read that verse at a time. Where I'm going to pick up, though, is chapter 32. As we get to chapter 32, and we know that Moses has been up on Mount Sinai with the Lord for 40 days and 40 nights, speaking with God, hearing God's commands, putting the law on these tablets, these 2 tablets of stone. It says, written with the finger of God. And so he's up there 40 days and 40 nights, and there's all kinds of thunder and lightning and smoke, all kinds up at the top of the mountain, and the people have been told, don't even touch the mountain, don't get close to it. The power of God and the presence of God is up there, and Moses is up there, and his right-hand man Joshua is about halfway up the mountain, kind of standing guard. And it's a time which God is meeting with Moses. But he's gone 40 days. And so we pick that up, chapter 32 of Exodus. It says 32:1. When the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said, "Come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us out of Egypt, we don't know what's happened to him." They probably thought he was dead. After 40 days and they saw the fire and smoke and everything up there on the mountain, they thought, well, he's got to be dead by now. Verse 2, Aaron answered them, "Take off the gold earrings that your wives, your sons, and your daughters are wearing. Bring them to me." So all the people took off their earrings and brought them to Aaron, and he took what they handed him and made it into an idol cast in the shape of a calf. Now that translation, calf, better translation would be young bull, the shape of a young bull, fashioning it with a tool. Then they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." Now, the question arose here, did they so quickly turn away from Yahweh, the Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, towards one of these gods of Egypt, that was in the form of a bull, a young bull? If you read what's next, it doesn't seem that way, because if you keep reading, verse 5, it says, "When Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of the young bull and announced, 'Tomorrow there will be a festival to Yahweh.'" A festival to the Lord, a festival to Yahweh. So I don't think they were necessarily breaking the first commandment. I think they were breaking the second commandment. I think they saw, well, Moses is the spokesperson for God. Moses is the one giving us God's orders. Moses is the one that helps us know the thoughts of God and the direction of God, but he's probably dead. We need a physical presence to be able to know what to do. And they said, well, back in Egypt, the gods spoke through the idols. The people went to the idols, and that the idols represented, Ra, the sun god, or Osiris, or whatever. And I think they wanted to combine the idolatry of Egypt with the worship of Yahweh and make an idol to somehow represent Yahweh. So I think what they're doing is sort of doing a hodgepodge of Egyptian religion and the worship of Abraham, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and kind of mixing it together and saying, make us an idol to represent Yahweh. Make it a bull, a young bull. So they're really breaking probably the first and the second commandment, but they're still thinking they're having a festival for Yahweh. And so that's what's happening. And it says, we're in verse 6, 32:6. "So the next day the people rose early and sacrificed burnt offerings and presented fellowship offerings. Afterward they sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry." Revelry. Now, what does that exactly mean, revelry? Well, they're eating and drinking. We're not sure what they're drinking, but they're engaging in revelry. "So the Lord said to Moses," verse 7, 32:7, "Go down." This is God speaking to Moses. "Go down, because your people, whom you brought up out of Egypt, have become corrupt." I think this is really funny, because God says to Moses, "Hey, Moses, your people are going wild." It's a constant back and forth between God and Moses. My people, your people. And when they're misbehaving, it tends to be your people. God says to Moses, "Hey, your people are out of line." And when Moses is frustrated with God, what am I supposed to do with your people, Lord? It's kind of like, no, they're your people. Well, actually, they're your people. And so here God says to Moses, "Go down, because your people, Moses, that you brought up out of Egypt, have become corrupt." I think that's pretty funny. "They've been quick to turn away from what I commanded and have made themselves an idol cast in the shape of a young bull. They've bowed down to it and sacrificed to it and have said, 'These are your gods, O Israel, that brought you out of Egypt.'" God continues, "I've seen these people," the Lord said to Moses, "and they are a stiff-necked people." Stiff-necked is just, means they're stubborn. Thick, they're thick. They don't listen. They're stubborn. They're going to do what they want to do. They're hard. They won't turn their head. They're stiff-necked. They're not going to turn towards me. They're stiff-necked. Now, leave me alone. This is God, still verse 10 now, 32:10. Leave me alone so that my anger may burn against them, that I may destroy them. Then I'll make you, Moses, into a great nation. So we're thinking, wait a minute. God has just said, I'm going to just wipe them all out. The whole kit and caboodle, all of them. I'm going to wipe them out. And I'm going to start over, and instead of the children of Abraham, it'll be the children of Moses. I'm going to wipe them all out, and we'll start over with your family, Moses. Now, is God really planning on doing that? Is that really what God's going to do, is wipe them all out and start over with the family of Moses? I think this is more of a test than it is a decision of God. He says, Moses, now get out of my way, and I'm going to wipe them all out. And then verse 11, Moses sought the favor of the Lord, his God. Oh, Lord, oh, Yahweh, he said, why should your anger burn against your people, whom you brought out of Egypt with great power and a mighty hand? Notice he says, now you brought them out. They're your people. Why should the Egyptians say it was with evil intent that he brought them out, to kill them in the mountains and to wipe them off the face of the earth? Turn from your fierce anger. Relent. Don't bring disaster on your people. Remember your servants, Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, to whom you swore by your own self. I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and I will give your descendants all this land I promised them, and it will be their inheritance forever. Then the Lord relented and did not bring on his people the disaster he had threatened. So I'm not sure that God was ever really going to wipe them all out. I think he wanted to hear Moses' response. And Moses' response is, they're your people. The Egyptians will say, you brought them out here to kill them. No. Remember, Lord, you promised Abraham, and he reminds God of his promise that, of course, God knew his promises. I think this has more to do with a little interplay between God and Moses than anything God was really going to do. So, there's a party going on down in the valley. So verse 15, Moses turned and went down the mountain with the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hands. They were inscribed on both sides, front and back. The tablets were the work of God. The writing was the writing of God engraved on the tablets. Another place that talks about written with the finger of God. When Joshua, because he's his right-hand man, Joshua heard the noise of the people shouting, he said to Moses, there's the sound of war in the camp. But Moses replied, it's not the sound of victory. It's not the sound of defeat. It's the sound of singing that I hear. When Moses approached the camp and saw the calf and the dancing, his anger burned, and he threw the tablets out of his hands, breaking them to pieces at the foot of the mountain. And he took the calf, the young bull that they had made, and burned it in the fire. Then he ground it into powder, scattered it on the water, and made the Israelites drink it. So they're going to drink the idol in powder form. He said to Aaron, what did these people do to you that you led them into such great sin? I mean, how did they force you into this, Aaron? What did they put a gun to your head? I mean, not literally. What did they do to make you do this, Aaron? To do this horrible thing? And I think Aaron's response is frankly hilarious. 32:22. Do not be angry, my lord, Aaron answered. You know how prone these people are to evil. They said to me, make us gods who'll go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what happened to him. So I told them, well, whoever has any gold jewelry, take it off. Then they gave me the gold, and I threw it into the fire, and out came this calf. I just took the gold and kind of threw it in the fire, and you know, a calf came out. A golden calf came out. It was just, I don't even know how it happened. Maybe that reminds you of a child in your household. How did this lamp get broken? Or who ate this cookie? Or who broke this? Oh, I don't know. It just happened. I have no clue. That's Aaron's answer. So verse 25, 32:25. Moses saw that the people were running wild, and that Aaron had let them get out of control. and become a laughingstock to their enemies. So he, Moses, stood at the entrance of the camp and said, "Whoever is for Yahweh, the Lord, come to me." And all the Levites rallied to him. Side note, remember, there are 12 tribes of Israel, named after the 12 sons of Jacob, aka Israel. One of those sons was Levi. So the descendants of Levi are the Levites. Moses and Aaron are of the tribe of Levi. They're Levites. And the Levites are the tribe responsible for worship. And all the priests are descendants of Aaron. So all priests are Levites. Not all Levites are priests, but all priests are Levites. If you're a descendant of Aaron, that means you're a Levite. But not every Levite was descended from Aaron. So there are other Levites who assist at the temple, but only the descendants of Aaron are priests. We're going to hear about that. But Moses says, if you're with the Lord, if you're with Yahweh, come to me. And the Levites, his people, his tribe, Moses and Aaron's tribe, the Levites, come to him. He says, verse 27, 32:27. He said to them, "This is what the Lord, Yahweh, the God of Israel, says. Each man strap a sword to his side, go back and forth through the camp from one end to the other, each killing his brother and friend and neighbor." The Levites did as Moses commanded, and that day about 3,000 of the people died. And Moses said, "You've been set apart to the Lord today, for you were against your own sons and brothers. He's blessed you this day." I think we're to understand that the Levites went after the ringleaders of this rebellion, who had decided that we need to build an idol. And it seems pretty harsh, but this was the cancer that had to be taken out in this understanding of how life in the desert was going. This rebellion. So the Levites kill apparently the rebels. The next day, verse 30, 32:30, the next day Moses said to the people, "You've committed a great sin. Now I'm going to go up to the Lord, and maybe I can make atonement for your sin." Verse 31, so Moses went back to the Lord and said, "Oh, what a great sin these people have committed. They've made themselves gods of gold. But now, please forgive their sin. If not, then blot me out of the book you've written." Moses is willing to take the fall for the people. He says, instead of just, wiping them out, just, I'll take the punishment. And God's not going to do that. The Lord replies in verse 33, "Whoever has sinned against me, I'll blot out of my book. Now go lead the people to the place I spoke of, and my angel will go before you. However, when the time comes for me to punish, I will punish them for their sin." And the Lord struck the people with a plague because of what they did with the calf, the young bull that Aaron made. There's consequences for the golden calf, the golden young bull. But God is not going to wipe them out. And we come now to chapter 33, and God again speaks to Moses and says, 33:1, "The Lord said to Moses, leave this place, you and the people you brought up out of Egypt, and go up to the land I promised an oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I'll send an angel before you to drive out the Canaanites, Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. Go up to the land flowing with milk and honey. But I will not go with you because you're stiff-necked. You're a stiff-necked people, and I might destroy you on the way." In other words, you are so out of control. If I travel with you, God is saying, you're going to just make me so angry, I'm going to zap you. I'll send an angel, but I'm not going with you. Now, in the idea of God leading them with the cloud and the fire, he says, I'm not going to be there. So the people are distressed at that. 33:4. When the people heard these distressing words, they began to mourn, and no one put on any ornaments. In other words, like, jewelry, earrings. For the Lord had said to Moses, "Tell the Israelites, you're a stiff-necked people, and if I were to go with you, even for a moment, I might destroy you. Now take off your ornaments, and I'll decide what to do with you." And the Israelites stripped off their ornaments at Mount Horeb. Now, think God is so disappointed in this people who he delivered out of slavery with miracles. And it seemed like in no time at all, they were ready to break the very commandments they swore to uphold, to worship an idol in sort of a semi-worship of him. And he says, I just, I'm afraid that if I go with you, you'll do it again, and I'll have to zap you. But that's not going to be the final word. We hear about what's called the tent of meeting in verses 33, 7 through 11. This was a separate tent where Moses would go in and hear from the Lord. And a cloud would come down to show that God was meeting with Moses in that place. And it says in verse 11, the Lord would speak to Moses face to face as a man speaks to his friend. Now, it says face to face, but in the very same chapter later on, God is going to say, no one can look at my face and live. It's too much. So when it says face to face, I think we're being a little more symbolic. In other words, there's a close relationship. There's a very close relationship that's like a face to face. But I don't think we're to picture God taking on human form and all that, because God, it makes a point of saying in later on, no one can look at my face. You can't see it. It's too glorious. It's too much. It'll overwhelm you. And so it says that Moses and the Lord meet in this tent of meeting, and Moses is still wanting God to go with them. Verse 12, Moses said to the Lord, you have been telling me, leave this people, but you haven't let me know whom you will send with me. You've said, I know you by name, and you found favor with me. If you're pleased with me, teach me your way so that I may know you and continue to find favor with you. Remember that this nation is your people. And the Lord replied, my presence will go with you and I'll give you rest. So God changes his mind, if he ever really was going to go through with that, and says, all right, I will lead you. And then Moses doubles down in verse 15. Moses said, if your presence doesn't go with us, don't send us up from here. How will anyone know that you're with us and that you're pleased with me and with your people unless you go with us? How else will we what else will distinguish me and your people from all the other people on the face of the earth? And the Lord said, I'll do the very thing you've asked because I'm pleased with you and I know you by name. So God says, I'll go with you, I'll lead you, I'll teach you. And then here's this mysterious thing. Verse 18, Moses said, show me your glory. Show me your glory. Verse 19, the Lord said, I will cause all my goodness to pass in front of you. I'll proclaim my name, Yahweh, in your presence. I'll have mercy on whom I will have mercy. I'll have compassion on whom I'll have compassion. But he said, you cannot see my face, for no one can see me and live. The presence of God is too powerful. It is not until after the time of Jesus that we are promised that there will be a place for us where we will see the Lord face to face. But before that, it's impossible. Verse 21, the Lord said, there's a place near me where you may stand on a rock, and when my glory passes by, I'll put you in a cleft in the rock and cover you with my hand until I've passed by. Then I'll remove my hand and you can see my back, but my face must not be seen. And so we have this mystical story of Moses experiencing the glory of God. And as God passes by, there's this verse where God speaks. And it says in 34:6, as he, the Lord, as he passed in front of Moses proclaiming, and here's the quote from God, Yahweh, Yahweh, or the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sins of the fathers to the third and fourth generation. Now that statement of God, his self-description of God in Exodus 34, 6 through 7, is a very precious verse to the Jewish people. It is referred to in the Old Testament more than any other verse. this self-description of God. God, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, on and on. This is a description of God that's either quoted or referred back to multiple times all through the Bible. Now, the part that might bother us is the whole thing about punishing the children of the father, because we don't live in the same culture. That culture, there was really no separation. And the family lived together and went together, and that separation that we think of, that independence that's part of our American understanding, is different from a Hebrew, Jewish understanding. But one commentator was saying, think about it. People married really young in these times, probably in mid-teens, people married, 13, 14, 15 years old. So a patriarch maybe would have children when he was a teenager, have grandchildren by the time of his 30s, have great-grandchildren in his 50s. So 4 generations. And in that culture, when the son would get a wife, they'd come back to live in the father's house. They might have to build on a new room. And then the grandson would get a wife, and they would come and live in the father's house. There would be 3, 4, maybe 5 generations all living in the same house at the same time. Which is why, jumping to the New Testament, if you've been to a funeral that I've conducted, or probably almost any funeral, you've heard the passage from John. In my Father's house there are many rooms. If it were not so, I go there to prepare a place for you. That's the idea of the Father's house having many rooms for many generations. So if the patriarch is a sinful man, an idolatrous man, and his sons and grandsons and all their families are all living with him, they're going to suffer because of his sin. If they're all living in the same house, there's going to be pain because of what that grandfather is doing. So it may not be so much like, oh, you're his kid, I'm going to punish you. No, it's more about, if you're part of that family, that sin is going to be hard to escape when you're all living in the same place and even in the same house. So, but God proclaims his compassion and his grace and his love and his faithfulness. And he, there in the rest of 34, is kind of a repetition of many of the commandments about the Sabbath, about not making idols, about the firstborn belongs to me, about celebrating the Passover, etc. And God says, remember all these things. One of the, I think, more interesting little bits there in chapter 34 is we talked about when Moses would meet with God, face to face, if not literally, then symbolically. God would have this close, intimate relationship with Moses. In verse 29 of chapter 34:29. When Moses came down from Mount Sinai with the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hands, he wasn't aware that his face was radiant because he'd spoken with the Lord. When Aaron and all the Israelites saw Moses, his face was radiant, and they were afraid to come near him. But Moses called to them, and so Aaron and all the leaders of the community came back to him, and he spoke to them. And afterwards all the Israelites came near him, and he gave them all the commands the Lord had given him on Mount Sinai. When Moses finished speaking to them, he put a veil over his face. But whenever he entered the Lord's presence to speak with them, he removed the veil until he came out. And when he came out and told the Israelites what he'd been commanded, they saw that his face was radiant. Then Moses would put the veil back over his face until he went in to speak with the Lord. Now, that's a kind of a mysterious thing. And here's what's, to me, again, interesting, at least historically. That phrase in Hebrew that is translated here in my NIV Bible, radiance from his face. His face was radiant. In Hebrew, it literally said rays, as in rays of light, rays from his head, R-A-Y-S, rays from his head. But when they were translating the Bible early on, in the Middle Ages, even at the time of the Renaissance, that Hebrew word and that Hebrew phrase, rays from his head, as in rays of light, they did not get it. There was no other Hebrew to compare it to. They couldn't translate it. They finally decided what it must mean was that when Moses came out from the presence of the Lord, he had horns. And so that's how it was translated in the very earliest translation. When Moses came out from the presence of the Lord, he had horns. He had horns from his head instead of rays from his head, rays of light from his head. And if you don't believe me, Google Michelangelo's statue of Moses. Michelangelo's statue of Moses. If you look at that, Michelangelo, following this translation, has horns. The statue has horns, which is one of those interesting mistranslations that came into art. Moses with horns, or just Google Moses with horns, and you'll see that statue and maybe some other representations of that mistranslation. So we go to chapter 35, and we now have a repetition of much of the material that we've already read. Materials for the temple. What are the priests going to wear? What's the ark going to look like? What about the lamps? What about the altar of incense? What about the different offerings? The third handout that I gave is, it should be on Facebook. If you're talking about offerings, here's that, and I think it may be backwards on my phone, but anyway, it looks like that. Look for that on the church's Facebook. It's a description of all the different kinds of offerings. And what did that mean? Well, people would bring usually an animal to the priests to sacrifice to God. Sometimes the priest would sacrifice the entire animal. Sometimes he would sacrifice just a symbolic portion of the animal, keep part of the meat for himself, the priest, and give the remainder of the meat to the worshiper to eat with his family or have a feast. And this little chart talks about the names of the different kinds of offerings. For example, the burnt offering, and this is really from Leviticus that describes this more fully. The burnt offering was, they burned the whole thing up. There was nothing left for the priest or the worshiper. There was the entire animal was burned up on the altar. That was called the burnt offering, or in some translations, which is really kind of spooky, it's referred to as the Holocaust offering. It means burn up the whole thing. Those of you who are familiar with what we now call the Holocaust, refers to the murder of 6 million Jews during World War II. And as you know, many of those Jews were taken to camps where they were placed first in gas chambers, and then they were burned in ovens. And that's why it was called the Holocaust, after this phrase, to burn up the whole thing. Not only have Jenny and I had the privilege of going to Israel twice, we've had the privilege of going to Poland twice. And in Poland is the infamous camp Auschwitz, the most notorious of the extermination camps for the Jews. And we toured Auschwitz. They talked about where the ovens were located, where the gas chambers were located. It's a place that would give you chills and make you think very deeply about how cruel people can be to other people, and how low humans can sink in their treatment of one another. But that's where the phrase Holocaust comes from. The whole thing is burned up in the burnt offering. Some of the other offerings, like the fellowship offering or the purification offering, they would bring the animal, the priest would burn a little of it, the priest would keep part of the meat as his payment, and then he would give the rest of the meat back to the worshiper to do with whatever he wanted. Now, the Jews were not the only religion to use animal sacrifice. Other religions also sacrificed animals, burnt animals up on an altar as part of their worship, including in ancient Rome, which is why you see in the letters of Paul a discussion. Is it okay for Christians to eat meat that has been used to sacrifice to a pagan god? Because the priests, both the Jewish priests and the priests like of Zeus and Apollo and Aphrodite and Athena and etc., those priests were paid often in meat, and they couldn't eat it all themselves. So for the pagan places, the pagan Greek and Roman temples, the temple was also the butcher shop. And if you were a good Roman and worshiped the Roman and Greek gods, and you wanted to have a dinner party, or you want to buy some meat, you'd go to the temple of Zeus and buy some meat. It had been used in a pagan offering to Zeus. And the question that Paul was answering for these new Christians, if my neighbor invites me to dinner and I think the meat has been used as a sacrifice to a pagan god, can I eat the meat? And Paul spends a lot of time on that, which to us is an issue that doesn't seem very relevant to us, but it actually is kind of relevant to us because Paul says, you know what? There is no Zeus, there is no Apollo, there is no Aphrodite. Those gods don't exist. Meat is meat. Don't ask questions. Eat what's set in front of you and don't worry about it. Unless you're with a friend, a Christian friend, has such a weak conscience that for them it would be sin. Don't eat it in front of them because that might cause them pain. But Paul's bottom line answer is, you know, if you're trying to basically be a witness to your pagan friend and they invite you for dinner, eat whatever they put in front of you and don't ask questions, because even if the meat was bought from the butcher shop at the temple of Zeus, it's still meat and there is no Zeus, so don't make a big deal about it. It's an interesting answer that Paul gives to that question that was really a hot topic in the New Testament. But the idea of animal sacrifice is indeed part of the Old Testament. And sometimes we think, ugh, animal sacrifice. That was the way in which the Jewish people worshipped in the tabernacle, and then later, after the time of Solomon, worshipped in the temple. So those chapters are a repetition of many of the chapters that we heard earlier about how to make the clothes, how to make the tabernacle, you know, how to make the cloths, the hung that surrounded the temple, and how to create the ark, and how to make the wooden different. I mean, it's just all about directions on how to make all this stuff and how to set it all up. And we come finally to the last chapter of Exodus 40. Excuse me. And it says, the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And 40:36, in all the travels of the Israelites, whenever the cloud lifted above the tabernacle, they would set out. And if the cloud didn't lift, they didn't set out until the day it lifted. So the cloud of the Lord was over the tabernacle by day, and fire in the cloud by night, in the sight of the house of Israel during all of their travels. That's the end of the book of Exodus. Now, we know the journey from Egypt to Palestine or Canaan was not a 40-year journey. You know, even the slowest group would not take 40 years to get there. It was maybe at the most a couple of months journey to go from Egypt to Canaan. Why did it take 40 years? Because this people are so stiff-necked and disobedient that God says, you're not going to get to go into the promised land, only your children will get to go. So the original group that comes out of Egypt doesn't get to go into the promised land. Only those born in the desert get to enter into the promised land. The only exception to that is Joshua, leads them over the Jordan into the promised land. Even Moses doesn't get to go. And that's how the book of Exodus ends. I think the book of Exodus is a fascinating book, even if it is filled with some weird sort of laws about my ox versus your ox, and even though it's filled with some really detailed descriptions of how to make the clothing for the high priest. The part of it that really strikes me is the relationship between God and Moses. This frank, honest relationship where Moses spoke freely to God and God spoke freely to Moses. You know, when they first encounter at the burning bush, and Moses is like, no, Lord, not me, send somebody else. And God's like, no, it's going to be you. And they back and forth, your people. I think they're your people. No, they're your people. This relationship between God and Moses, I think, is the heart of this book. And it shows us that we can be honest with God. We don't have to hide anything from God. We don't have to mince words with God. He already knows everything. We're not hiding anything from him. We need to be upfront and honest with God. And God can take it, even when we're upset, even when we're mad, even when we're disappointed, even when we're doubting. God is big enough to take all our truth and listen, and we hear him in the scriptures, and we hear him in the voices of our friends in faith, and we we hear God respond, and we can be as honest with him as we are with our closest friend, with our spouse, or with anybody else. I think this is a great, great book, and I love every time I read the book of Exodus or study it or teach it, I'm always just moved by this relationship that we see between God, Yahweh, the Lord, and Moses, the lawgiver of Torah, the law. And again, apologize that we didn't get the first run sound, but hopefully this I've covered just about everything I covered earlier this evening, and hopefully if you've been watching this series online, you'll feel complete. And I always like to end with prayer. Let's end with a word of prayer. Lord, we're so grateful again for your guidance and presence, and ask, Lord, even now that you bless us with your spirit and your wisdom, and bless all the people we love. And all this we pray in your name. Amen. All right, guys. See you soon. See you Sunday.